She looked at me with a softness that carried years of silence, then whispered, "You remind me of nights long gone." I didn't know whether to step closer or walk away forever. The first time I saw her, the evening air carried a hush, as though the world itself had grown tired and wanted to rest. I had been invited to a small gathering, nothing extravagant, just a quiet dinner where people spoke softly, glasses clinked, and laughter came in small bursts rather than waves. I wasn't expecting much beyond polite conversations. But then she walked in. Her presence wasn't loud or demanding. It was quieter than that, almost too easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. She carried herself with a grace that didn't need to be announced. A dark dress, simple yet elegant, framed her figure. Her hair, brushed neatly to one side, caught the light in a way that made me pause. There was a stillness about her, something deeper than composure. When she smiled at someone across the room, it wasn't the kind of smile that came from light-hearted amusement. It was softer, restrained, a smile you give when you've learned how much weight a heart can carry. That was the first thing I noticed about her, the way her joy seemed tinged with something unspoken. I found myself stealing glances, not because she was beautiful, though she was, undeniably, but because there was something in her that pulled at me, like a faint echo of music you recognize but can't place. She held her glass carefully, fingers resting on the rim as though she were afraid it might slip away. The smallest gestures spoke volumes. How her eyes lingered on people's laughter just a second longer. How her posture stayed straight even when her shoulders looked tired. When our eyes met for the first time, I felt it. That strange recognition, the kind that feels less like meeting someone new and more like remembering someone you should have never forgotten. She didn't look away quickly, as most people do. Instead, she studied me for a breath too long. Not in a way that unsettled me, but in a way that stirred something I couldn't explain. Later, when she was introduced to me by name, her handshake was gentle, her palm cool against mine. She held my gaze, as though testing whether I would falter. But I didn't. There was quiet strength in her, yet beneath it, a trace of fragility, the kind of vulnerability that someone hides carefully until life presses too hard. And in that moment, with nothing more than a name and a lingering glance, I knew this was not going to be just another passing encounter. Something about her carried the weight of untold stories, and I found myself wanting, almost desperately, to hear them. It didn't take long for the room to swallow her again, conversations pulling her one way, laughter drawing her another. But somehow, the spaces between always led her back near me. Not by design, I think, but by some quiet current neither of us cared to resist. When the evening began to thin out, I found her standing at the far edge of the terrace, the faint glow of a lantern softening her features. She wasn't surrounded by voices this time. She was alone, looking out into the garden where shadows bent over the grass. Something about the stillness of her silhouette urged me closer, though I hesitated. I told myself it would be nothing more than a brief exchange of words. When I finally stepped near, she glanced over her shoulder. Her eyes held a calm steadiness, the kind you don't often find in people my age. She didn't seem surprised to see me, almost as if she had been expecting it. We spoke of simple things first, the evening, the music playing faintly inside, the weather. But even her casual words carried a certain weight. There was richness in her voice, the kind that lingers, deep and low, touched with warmth but edged by restraint. It wasn't what she said, but the way she said it, as though every word had to pass through a quiet filter of memory before it reached her lips. I listened more than I spoke. It felt natural. She had a presence that made silence between words feel valuable. Every now and then, her laughter would escape, low and sudden, and it startled me with how alive it sounded compared to the rest of her. For those brief seconds, she wasn't carrying anything heavy. She was simply present, and it was disarming to witness. At one point, as she leaned slightly forward to emphasize something, her fingers brushed against my sleeve. The touch was fleeting, almost accidental, but I felt it deeper than I should have. It wasn't charged or deliberate, just the light graze of her hand, yet it sent a warmth curling up my arm, leaving me strangely restless. Her eyes caught mine then, and for a moment she didn't look away. There was no flirtation in it, not even an invitation. It was closer to recognition, like she saw something in me that mirrored something inside her. The conversation drifted again, but I was no longer hearing only her words. I was listening for the silences, the pauses where her gaze fell to the ground, the slight tightening of her lips before she moved on. Every gesture, every shift of her voice carried a story unspoken. And as the night grew later, I realized my curiosity wasn't fading. If anything, it was deepening, pulling me toward her in ways I hadn't expected. The days that followed unfolded in quiet patterns, yet I found her presence woven into each one. We never planned it, not once. Still, at dinners, in gardens, or seated by a fading fire, we seemed to drift toward each other, as though gravity had chosen for us. Our conversations grew longer. What began as brief exchanges about books or passing moments of music turned into hours that slipped by unnoticed. She had a way of speaking that was never hurried. Each word felt chosen, not out of calculation, but because silence mattered to her just as much as speech. She could hold a pause without discomfort, her gaze steady, letting the moment breathe until I felt compelled to fill it. I learned that she loved old songs, not the kind you hear on the radio, but the kind you stumble upon in dusty records, voices that carried echoes of another age. She spoke of evenings long ago, when music filled her house, and laughter came easily. She never spoke directly of her loss, but it lingered between the lines of her stories, like the shadow of a candle flickering on the wall. One evening, we found ourselves walking the garden paths after most of the guests had gone inside. The air was cool, touched with the faint sweetness of jasmine. The lanterns along the path cast soft pools of light, and in them, her features looked both delicate and strong. She carried her shawl close around her shoulders, and when the breeze caught it, I instinctively reached out to steady it. My fingers grazed the fabric near her arm. She looked at me then, a half-smile forming, as though she had noticed my hesitation more than the gesture itself. Later, sitting near the fire, she told me about the books that shaped her youth, how some words never leave you no matter how many years pass. She leaned forward to place her cup on the table, and in that small movement, our shoulders touched. Neither of us pulled away. It wasn't intentional, perhaps, but the closeness lingered. I could feel the warmth of her body through the fabric of her sleeve, and suddenly the crackle of the fire seemed louder, the silence heavier. When she looked at me, it wasn't with expectation. It was something gentler, curiosity mixed with guardedness, as if she was searching for something she wasn't sure she wanted to find. And I, caught in the quiet glow of her presence, realized that I didn't just want to hear her stories anymore. I wanted to be part of the one still unwritten. It was a quieter evening than most. The house was dim, lanterns giving off a low amber glow, shadows stretching long across the walls. A few voices lingered in the background, but even they felt distant, softened, as if the world had decided to hush itself for us. She and I sat apart from the others, in a small alcove where the window let in just enough moonlight to blur the edges of the room. Our conversation had begun with something ordinary, a memory about music, an old melody she said she hadn't heard in years. But as she spoke, her voice changed. It slowed, deepened, carrying not just words but the weight of something more. I found myself leaning in, drawn closer not by curiosity alone, but by the pull of her presence, the way each syllable seemed to unlock a door she rarely opened. For a moment she grew silent, her gaze settling on me. It wasn't the casual glance of earlier nights. This was something else, a study, a searching. Her eyes held me, unflinching, as though she were comparing the man before her to someone she once knew. Then she said it. "You remind me of nights long gone." The words hung in the air, soft but unshakable, heavy with memory. My breath caught before I could respond. She didn't look away, though I could see the flicker of hesitation in her eyes, as if she had let something slip she had promised herself to keep hidden. I felt the meaning press in from all sides. It wasn't simply that I looked like someone, or that my presence stirred nostalgia. It was deeper, heavier, as though my nearness had unlocked something she had tucked away, a longing wrapped tightly in grief. Her hand was resting on the arm of the chair between us. Slowly, almost unconsciously, Her fingers shifted until they brushed against mine. It wasn't deliberate, not bold, but neither was it purely accidental. The contact was feather-light, yet I felt it in my chest more than in my hand. My pulse quickened, though I forced myself to stay still. When she realized what she had done, she didn't withdraw immediately. Instead, she left her hand there, resting gently, her gaze breaking away toward the window as if afraid to read my reaction. I could have spoken. I could have asked what she meant, pressed her for the story behind her words. But something in me knew it wasn't the moment for questions. Some truths can't be forced. They can only be allowed to bloom when the heart is ready. So I stayed quiet, letting her touch linger against mine, letting the silence wrap around us like a fragile thread neither of us dared break. The days after her words felt different. Something had shifted, though either of us spoke of it directly. A boundary had been brushed, not broken, and in its wake, silence began to weigh heavier than before. I found myself thinking of her more than I should have, carrying her voice in my head long after I left the gatherings. You remind me of nights long gone. The phrase repeated itself, not like a memory, but like a question I hadn't learned how to answer. When I saw her again, she was changed too, though not in obvious ways. Her laughter was shorter, her glances toward me quicker, as though she was afraid of being caught in them. She kept a little more distance between us, never enough to seem cold, but enough that I noticed. And yet, even in her restraint, she revealed more than she intended. I saw it in the way her fingers lingered on her shawl when I entered a room, as if steadying herself. I saw it in the way her eyes softened whenever our hands brushed while reaching for the same cup or book. She tried to hide it, but closeness has a way of revealing what words refuse. For me, the conflict was sharper. I knew how it might appear to others, a young man standing too near a woman who had already lived more years than I. I knew what would be whispered, the way eyes would follow us if the truth of our closeness ever reached beyond these quiet evenings. And yet, I couldn't seem to pull away. There was something in her company that steadied me, something rare and deeply human. One evening, the rain began suddenly, drumming against the roof while we stood beneath a narrow awning outside the house. The others were still inside, their voices muffled by the storm. She drew her shawl tighter, and I stood beside her, close enough to hear her breath in the hush between raindrops. Her hand hovered near mine, not touching, but close enough that the air between us seemed charged, alive. I thought about reaching out, about closing the distance, but the weight of hesitation held me still. I could feel her wrestling too, her shoulders tense, her gaze fixed on the storm rather than on me. It was as if we both stood on the edge of something vast, waiting for the other to move first. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. And in that silence, I realized the truth. We were not afraid of each other, but of what it might mean if we allowed ourselves to give in. It was late when it happened, later than usual, when most had already gone, and the house had settled into that particular stillness that only comes after a long day. A faint tune played from an old record in the corner, its notes, fragile and steady, filling the silence without breaking it. She and I were alone, though either of us had intended it that way. She sat across from me, the lamplight falling softly over her features, highlighting the curve of her cheek, the quiet thoughtfulness in her eyes. She wasn't speaking much, and I didn't press her. It felt as though we were both waiting for something, though either of us could name it. When she finally looked up, her expression was unguarded in a way I had never seen before. There was no composure, no carefully placed smile. Just rawness, and the courage it took to let me see it. "You've unsettled me," she said softly, her voice trembling at the edges. "I thought I had closed those parts of myself, the ones that still remember what it feels like to want someone near." The words cut through me, not sharp, but deep. I didn't move at first. I only watched her, the rhythm of her breathing rising and falling, steady yet fragile. She wasn't asking for reassurance. She wasn't even asking for me. She was confessing something to herself, and I happened to be the witness. I leaned forward then, slowly, not daring to break the delicate balance of the moment. "You've unsettled me too," I admitted. The words felt heavy in my mouth, not because they were hard to say, but because they were true. She let out a breath, part relief, part fear. Her hand, resting on the armrest, curled slightly as though reaching for something unseen. Without thinking, I placed my hand over hers. It was a simple touch, careful, respectful, yet it carried more weight than any embrace I'd ever known. Her skin was cool at first, then warmed beneath my palm. She didn't pull away. A silence followed, but it wasn't the tense silence of hesitation. It was a silence that felt alive, charged with all the words either of us had the courage to speak. Slowly, she leaned toward me, not to close the distance entirely, but enough that her head came to rest lightly against my shoulder. I felt her there, the weight of her, the steadiness of her breath, the quiet surrender in the way she allowed herself that closeness. My chest ached, not from discomfort, but from the enormity of it. I placed my other hand gently over hers, anchoring her there, as if to say without words, I'm here. I will not run from this. And for the first time, either of us pulled away.